My friends, in many ways, this week's Parashat is simply a continuation of the story we started 2 weeks ago. The Israelites have been released from bondage. They're being still pursued by the Egyptians, and finally, they're set free to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Moses and Aaron are still directing the Exodus, leading the Israelites away from Egypt, across the Red Sea, and toward the Promised Land. Seems pretty straightforward, right? It's also a story we should know. We read it twice a year. And so tonight, I instead want to focus on how the Parashat begins and how the Parashat ends. The very first verse of this week's Parashat, the very first verse, tells us that Hashem leads the Israelites out of Egypt initially by taking them around the land of the Philistines, believing that the Israelites may have a change of heart when they see war and return to Egypt. Now, this path is more circuitous. If they had been able to go through the land of the Philistines, it would have been more direct. But they do eventually, of course, reach the Red Sea in freedom. Now, after some months have passed, we read at the end of this week's Parashat that the Israelites do battle with Amalek. Now, the Israelites didn't start this fight. It's very clear in the Torah that Amalek came to them. There appears to have been no hesitation on Moses' part before instructing Joshua to recruit soldiers to go and fight Amalek. So, what changed? How did the Israelites go from a people whom Hashem feared might lose heart just seeing war to one willing to dive immediately into battle? Now, the obvious theological answer is that the people had a much greater knowledge of Hashem's power. They saw him lead them from a pillar that alternated of clouds during the day and fire at night. They saw him already provide food when they were hungry and water when they were thirsty. And he saw them slay, let's be honest about it, kill the entire Egyptian army by causing the waters of the Red Sea to drown them. And now, despite some ongoing grumbling about hunger and thirst, which, let's be honest, they're in the desert walking around, I get it. There seems to be at this point a genuine recognition that Hashem is there. And Hashem is quite powerful. But I want to offer another, maybe more applicable to modern times, explanation. First of all, we are told, we read this last week, that the crowd of Israelites was huge. It contained about 600,000 fighting men on foot, which Rashi defines as those men 20 years or older. So I think it is safe to say that it's more than 1 million people who are moving around together. This is not a small group. This is not the people in this room. This is 1 million plus Israelites. And so this, despite there being no evidence of any previous battles, the Torah describes them as fighting men. And this gives us the implication that perhaps the Israelites always had this potential to fight. Now, without necessity, they might have shrunk from seeing the war. They might have been afraid. They might have wanted to turn around. But that doesn't mean that they wouldn't fight when war came to them. Maybe they needed to be pushed by circumstance into achieving their potential, into realizing what they were capable of. Maybe we can, acknowledge the fighting was for survival, though we know the rest of the Torah has lots of instances of fighting. The prophets have even more. Examples of the Israelites taking war to others, killing entire nations. Now, remember, these are people who until recently had been enslaved. Their entire lives, they'd known nothing but slavery. Their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, on and on, back for 400 years, had known nothing but slavery. Freedom was destined, natural to think it would be a shock to their collective system. The complaining about food and water was understandable. But once these necessities were established, they were able to focus on what lay ahead, which for them meant basically dying in the desert eventually. That's a different story. How often in our own lives have we needed a moment, needed to take a quick second to take some deep breaths when confronting a difficult situation for the first time? The unknown seems insurmountable, and we're sort of grasping at how to handle it. Little in my life, probably nothing, has been as big a system reset as when I became a father 7.5 years ago. The very first night my wife and I brought home our son, the concept of caring for this infant seemed absurd. They let us take a baby home? We thought, what were they thinking? And thankfully,
I'll wait till you.
you don't want to come here and hear about your cousin?
What?
You don't want to come in here and hear about your cousin?
I'll hear all about it, yeah.
No, Mason.
Oh, Mason?
Thankfully, we had help those first couple of nights, and slowly we figured it out. The reality is that we are adaptable. We have much more potential than we think. At first, something throws us off, and then you look at it more neutrally, and eventually you figure out what you're doing. Sure, it's helpful when Hashem shows up and provides food, and provides water, and provides you a way to go. But sometimes, your Hashem is a friend stopping by, or sending you a note when you need one, or your mom sleeping on your couch when you bring your son home from the hospital. So as we move into this next week, I want us all to think about how we can be that person, be that Hashem for someone in our own lives. Shabbat Shalom.